Hey, Wally, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Good morning, and Erev Shabbos, everybody. We have often spoken about issues concerning minhag and halacha, and how very often the minhag becomes the halacha, and that's a field that has so many permutations. One of the major differences that exist in the Jewish community today is the split between what we might call Ashkenazic and Sephardic observances, both in terms of minhag and halacha. So I think it's important to understand who the Sephardim are, who the Ashkenazim are, where the Yemenites or Ethiopians fit into this, and their customs and their halachic practices. So first of all, you should be aware that in the time of the Gemara already, you had variations, minor to be sure, but differences in davening between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. There were small differences which migrated with the Jewish people. I should mention at the beginning that the Ethiopian Jewish community is a very distinct unit. The Queen of Sheba was one of King Solomon's wives, and that community was really set apart from most of the rest of the Jewish world for many centuries. Their language is different. They speak a language called Giz. Their Torah is the actual Torah scroll is different, and their practices are very different. Their practices go back to the first Beis Hamikdash, and when they first came to Israel, aside from having tremendous culture shock, integrating into what became normative Judaism was very difficult for the first generations of Ethiopians. Their customs stand totally separate from the rest of the Jewish world because they were separated for so many centuries. The Yemenite Jewish community, the Sephardic Jewish communities of North Africa and the Mediterranean area developed along very distinct lines, as opposed to the practices that developed in Europe parallel to the same development. You have two distinct Jewish communities. It affects not only minhagim, different things that they actually do in terms of halachic practice, but also even how they pronounce Hebrew. And this is a major bone of contention between the Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities. I remember very clearly, it was a Purim. I was a student at Yeshiva, and they were going to learn Megillah in the dormitory. And the Mashgiach, Rav Yaakov Lesson, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, davened with us, and an Israeli student was going to learn Megillah. And Rav Lesson said, no. He's a very nice person. He's a nice guy. Nothing against him personally, but his pronunciation is not our pronunciation.
Hello.
And he was concerned as to whether or not we would
Morning, Gary. You okay?
properly fulfill the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah from somebody whose pronunciation of Hebrew was totally different from the majority of people in the room. So the issue of embarrassing him was a separate issue, but he wouldn't let him learn Megillah. And this question comes up today very often. If you are davening in a shul whose nusach hatfilah is different than yours, do you keep yours or you follow the shul? Does it also affect pronunciation? Moshe Feinstein has a number of tshuvos on this issue. We'll come back to this topic later. Where did these two communities diverge? Where did they come from? Why is there such a variation? So going back to the earliest period, when the first temple was destroyed and many Jews were taken as captives to Babylon, and many remained in Babylon and did not come back to Israel with Ezra, where they were allowed to do so. And the pronunciation of Hebrew was pretty much lost. this was when Ezra had to institute the triennial cycle, because they had to explain every pasuk from Hebrew into Aramaic, and laning would take a very long time. So they established 3 years to finish a Torah cycle instead of doing it once a year the way we do. The Hebrew pronunciation was influenced tremendously by the way that Aramaic was spoken in Babylonia. Many of these Jews eventually migrated to Spain, which also has a specific pronunciation in terms of Spanish. And between the Babylonian influence and the Spanish influence, the pronunciation of Hebrew became what is known as the Sephardic Havara, the Sephardic pronunciation that we have today. There's no differentiation between a kamatz and a patach. A suf is pronounced like a tuf, and so forth and so on. That's the Sephardic pronunciation, according to one theory. The Ashkenazic pronunciation is the way most Jews from Europe read Hebrew. And there, too, it's split off into many variations. Hasidim from Poland or Lithuania and Galicia pronounce Hebrew differently. If a word is Baruch, the way it's pronounced in normative Ashkenazic pronunciation, it's not Burich. Burich is not Baruch. And Rav Schwab, it comes down very hard about Hasidim who mispronounce Hebrew. And they pass this on generations. It's already a number of generations where their pronunciation of Hebrew is not what the text, not what normative Ashkenazic pronunciation is. Most theories will tell you that the Sephardic pronunciation, the way it's pronounced in Israel today, or perhaps even in Yemen, which has a pronunciation, the letter ayin. We don't pronounce the letter ayin. Yemenites pronounce the ayin. Ayin has like like a letter ng. And a person who is a very, very good and knowledgeable Bal Koreh will pronounce the ayin when he lanes. That's why you get the Yiddish word Yankel. Where does Yankel come from? Yankel is the Yiddish version of Yaakov. But if you pronounce the ayin the way it's supposed to be pronounced, it's Yaakov. So all these things combined, this is part of our contemporary culture. My theory is totally, radically different from everybody else's. I follow Professor Irving Agus, one of the pioneers of Ashkenazic Jewish history. His theory is very simple. When the Second Temple was destroyed, Jews went from Israel and were taken as slaves and packed captives to Rome, where either they became slaves or they were redeemed by the Jewish community that was already in Rome, Pidyon Shivuyim, redemption of captives. But they brought with them the Hebrew that was pronounced in Israel in the time of the Mishnah. The Jews from Italy eventually migrated to Germany and France and the rest of Europe. They took with them their pronunciation of Hebrew. So it is my contention that the Ashkenazic pronunciation, contrary to what most people will tell you, my theory is that the Ashkenazic pronunciation is the one that is more accurate and historically correct. But that's a separate battle among historians and scholars. The Minhagim, however, differ tremendously, and they have halakhic ramifications. Do you put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed? Do you not? And if you do you make a bracha or you don't make a bracha? Many other variations. In davening, the nusach is different. And then you had, aside from, again, these are minor variations. What if you follow one particular minhag? If you follow, let's say you come from a Hasidic background and you move to Fairlawn and you join Shomrei Torah, which is not a Hasidic shtibel, we daven nusach Ashkenaz. Do you keep your family's traditional way of davening, or do you adopt the new nusach of the shul in which you find yourself? If you're going to be here permanently, in all probability, the halakhic position would be to adopt the Nusach Ashkenaz, certainly if you're davening for the Amud. That's very clear. When you're davening for the Amud, you have to follow the shul's practice. In your own private Shemona Esrei, if you want to keep your family's tradition, that's a different story. In Israel, there are shuls where the minhag of the shul is whoever gets to daven sets the tone. There's a fascinating place in Rechavia, in Jerusalem. The name of the shul is Shtibalach. In 1948, when the Arabs kicked all the Jews out of Jerusalem, a lot of different small Shtibalach came together in this one building. The building has many, many rooms, and every room is a different shtibel, and every room practically has a different nusach. And you can find, and they daven there almost 24 hours a day. So you can always find a minyan there, and in many, many different nuschos. So the halachic ramifications are very, very contemporary. People come from different communities. People travel from place to place, and they bring with them different customs in terms of pronunciation and in terms of the nusach hatfila. Again, the variations may not be minor. Nakdishok instead of nakadesh and aritzcha. They're minor variations, but nevertheless, these variations reflect a certain custom from a different location. And do you bring that custom with you, or do you adopt a new custom? And this is a discussion among the postmen. How binding the family customs are.
Wow.
Must you them? Are you allowed to change them? Under what situation should you change them? Should you go from one nusach to another? If I've been davening nusach Sfard my entire life, and now I join an Ashkenazic shul, do I switch my nuschos? And there are tremendous halakhic discussions about that. You also have a new variant added in, the Kabbalist, the Ari, Yitzchak Arya Luria, who's known as the Ashkenazi Rabbi Yitzchak, based on Kabbalistic understanding, introduced minor variations into the Sephardic Nusach, and certain Hasidic groups adopt Nusach Ari in their davening, Lubavitch in particular. So Nusach Ari is not exactly the same as Nusach Sfard. And then if you have the opportunity, if you're in Yerushalayim, to daven at the Italian synagogue, it's on Rachov Hillel, I think. It's 2 blocks before what's that big street where all the shop everybody gathers there. Anyhow, it's in the middle of Yerushalayim. And they have a Roman nusach, which is different from Ashkenaz and Sfard. It's very pretty how they pronounce Hebrew. Again, in that shul, that's their nusach. If I'm davening my private Shemona Esrei, I daven my nusach, but the siddur that I have is a nusach Romani. Different nuschos. Changing of the rights is a machlokes haposkim. I won't go through all the different shuvos of the Achronim and the contemporary poskim. The Vilna Gaon introduced many, many changes into the Nusach HaTfilah based on grammar. Rav Soloveitchik had his own nuschos that he added in, which change not necessarily the meaning, but how certain words are read. The pronunciation of certain Hasidic groups, as I mentioned, really changes Hebrew completely. And as I said, there are many people who are opposed to the Hasidic pronunciation. People who come from Hasidic backgrounds into non-Hasidic communities, halachically, should probably adopt the nusach and the minhagim of the particular shul to which they currently belong. In your private Shemona Esrei, if you want to keep the old nusach, that's okay. If you go into a shul, that's one nusach, and you have a different nusach, you follow the shul's nusach. That's the general normative procedure. Pronunciation, a little more difficult. One of the things that I don't understand, and it's very, very problematic, most day schools and I'm not talking about Hasidic day schools, but most modern Orthodox day schools teach the children to pronounce Hebrew with a Sephardic inflection, Sephardic accent. Yet they come from homes that are Ashkenazic. And this is a halakhic question. When the kid gets up to lane for his bar mitzvah, and he's laning in nusach, pronunciation of the Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew, are all the people in shul Yotzi Kriyas HaTorah? According to some poskim, they're not. And this is a very, very big problem because in most of our shuls, that's how the kids lane. When you have young kids who are laning, most of them lane in Sephardic pronunciation because that's how they learn Hebrew. And it's very bizarre because most of the Rebbeim in the yeshivos, elementary and high school, are Ashkenazic, at least in our neighborhood. Yet, when they learn Hebrew, the kids pronounce it the way Israelis, or close to what Israelis pronounce. However, as time goes on, many of the parents, and this is a fascinating sociological thing, many parents who are day school graduates themselves, they may have learned Sephardic pronunciation, but despite that, they themselves still read Hebrew with an Ashkenazic intonation. So halakhically, it does pose a question.
Why?
I'm sorry?
Why is that any different? You know, like a kid or a grown-up reading Torah according to the Sfaradit as opposed to Ashkenazic pronunciation. Why is that any different than I've been to many different shuls where I've heard Torah readers that one either can't understand because they're too quiet or they're too fast or their pronunciation is who knows what. So why is that any different?
It's not. It's not different at all. You're 100% correct.
So if it's, unless there's a permanent Torah reader reading according to the way the shul expects him to read, then it's really up for grabs anytime someone reads Torah.
So you're right on two counts. Number one, there are many shuls that have permanent balei kriya. And number two, it's problematic sometimes when people either are too quiet or too fast or pronounce things differently. Yeah. And this is a serious issue. I know that in many shuls, there is an individual whose job it is to approve people who lane. My son-in-law, who's a wonderful Bal Koreh, that was his job, the Young Israel of Cedarhurst, which he gave up after a while because it became too problematic politically. What do you mean my son can't lane? Halachically, it presents a lot of questions. When you have kids who lane, who mispronounce words, who go too fast, or you can hardly hear them, it's very nice for their bar mitzvah that they want to lane, but then they should lane properly.
It's not only kids.
Yeah.
What about grown-ups?
You are 100% correct.
But I don't understand why that makes a difference on someone who's in the Kehillah listening. Why, if I'm following the Torah reading, regardless of whether the guy is too quiet or too loud or too fast, but I'm following, then aren't I yotze from hearing it?
If you can hear the entire Kriya, yes, you are yotze. But the question is, if you're hearing it in a nusach or a pronunciation that is not standardized for that particular shul, there is a question if, in fact, you are yotze. And there are some poskim who would say, if our nusach is nusach Sfard, or if our nusach is nusach Ashkenaz, or nusach Ari, or whatever the nusach might be, that should be the standardized nusach for those who lane. And unfortunately, the key issue, and this is an issue that is much broader than laning, the key issue, which is very frustrating to me personally and many other people as well, unfortunately, very few shuls have standards. I hate to say it as bluntly as that. Very few shuls have standards, and they could say to somebody, you know something, you're wearing shorts. You can't daven for the Yomid, period. That's it. We have a standard. If you're not properly dressed, if you can't read Hebrew, if you don't know how to lane properly, it's a question of standards. There used to be a person in charge of who gets up to daven, but today it's I say there are places in the Breuer Kehillah. Now I'm going back now 50 years when I used to daven there occasionally. They have two chazanim on Shabbos. They have one guy every Shabbos who davens shacharis, and one person every Shabbos who davens musaf. These are the permanent balei tefillah for shacharis and musaf. And you don't get an aliyah in that shul unless they know your family going back 3 generations. They have certain standards. Unfortunately, most shuls today don't have those same standards. So whether it's Ashkenazic pronunciation, Sephardic pronunciation, there's a whole range of different issues. But just be aware that minhagim and pronunciation have tremendous halakhic ramifications, to the point that there are some poskim who will tell you that a person who reads Hebrew very differently from you may not allow you to fulfill your obligation of Chazoras Hashatz or Kriyas HaTorah. We are very lax in that regard. If somebody in our shul is Israeli and he has a yahrzeit, he gets up to daven, period. And even though the majority of the shul is Ashkenazic, his Israeli Hebrew, as pleasant as it might be to listen to, may not help us fulfill our obligation of Chazaras Hashatz. We let it go.
Rabbi Wally, if I could just interject, this
Yes.
past Monday and Thursday, if you were at the first minyan, we heard Kriyas HaTorah from Temani. Ooh, I don't even think that's Hebrew.
I remember Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zal had a terrible voice, but he was very medakdek in Kriyas HaTorah, and it was painful to listen to him. But you can every dagesh, every ayin was pronounced, every letter was pronounced. It was a very slow, and that's why he didn't lane very often. It was a very slow laning, but he was very, very, there are very few balei kriya like him. Professor Moshe Bernstein at YU was one of them. That pronounced every single dot, every single ayin, and we have a few people in our shul that try to do that. It's all part of a general malaise of what things we take seriously and how seriously we take them. There's nothing wrong with Nusach Sfard. There's nothing wrong with Nusach Harid. These are all, but if you are in a location where that is not the normative Nusach, are you Yotzei Kriyas HaTorah, Chazoras Hashatz, with somebody whose Nusach is not yours? It's not a simple question. And certainly if you're davening for the Amud, you should probably daven in the accepted Nusach of the shul, not necessarily your own ancestral Nusach. And when it comes to pronunciation, it could be problematic as well. If you come from a Hasidic background, we have a number of people in our shul who come from a Hasidic background, and when they daven, it's as if they're home back in their shtibel in Brooklyn, or wherever it was they came from. And that raises some halachic issues. Now, we generally don't make it into an issue. Halachically, it could raise certain questions. Again,
Wally,
yes.
Wally, I think what's worse than the type of nusach is a balkore that reads so quickly that you cannot follow and understand the words that he's saying.
100%.
That to me is worse than the nusach.
You are 100. There are shuls in Israel that publish a written list of requirements for a person in order to be able to get up to be a shliach tzibur, to be a bal koreh. They have a guidebook. The same way you have a madrich for gaboyim to say certain things for certain occasions. There's a madrich. They put together a halachic compendium of things you have to do to be a shliach tzibur and to be a bal koreh, and it's posted right next to the bima. Some places have standards. Most places do not. And it's a concern. I will simply say that the halacha is not just when it's convenient to do so, or just what you're used to. There are prescribed things of what you may or may not do. And for some reason, there's a laxity in observing these halachic, what you might call minutia. Now, minhagim cause certain things, and unfortunately, the minhag is, kol asher yasha be'einav yaseh. Whatever anybody wants to do is fine. It used to be for the halacha is, for example, when it comes to saying kaddish, the halacha is one person says kaddish. That's it. If you are a mourner, you take turns. But one person says kaddish and everybody answers Yehei Shmei Rabbah. Fights broke out as to who should be the one to say kaddish, and therefore the accepted practice in almost every shul is that all the mourners say kaddish together. In some places they stand in front of the shul, some places by the bima, but they all say it together. The halacha is not that way. The halacha is one person says kaddish. And I know a friend of mine, when his father died, didn't say kaddish almost for an entire year, unless he was the only person in shul that had to say kaddish, because only one person says it at a time. So somehow the halakha kind of morphed into what is standard accepted practice today. Once it becomes standard already, then it might assume some halakhic status, perhaps. I'm not the one to paskin, not Shiur. All I wanted to point out is that the differences in nusach, in pronunciation, in actual words, has a long, long history. And it's important that, number one, there should be uniformity in a shul, certainly in terms of those who get up to daven for the Amud, and certainly for those who lane. To what extent shuls effectively have standards and enforce them, unfortunately, too often this is embroiled in politics rather than halacha. And that's unfortunate. But I know that if we try to follow the halacha strictly, there would be a lot of disappointed people. People would quit the shul. There'd be fights. And rather than engage in those types of difficult confrontations, so a long time ago, shuls made a decision. All right, we'll let it go. This guy wants to daven this way. This guy wants to pronounce Hebrew that way. We won't make an issue of it. Shalom al Yisrael. The halacha is not always that forgiving. I just wanted to point out that the differences in the actual difference in the nusach hatfilah are not that major. Pronunciation is a major factor, because if you're not pronouncing the Hebrew the way the shul is normally accustomed to hearing it, then there are halakhic issues as to whether or not you're Yotzei Kriyas HaTorah or even Yotzei Chazoras HaShatz. And these are issues that some rabbis have raised and dealt with, but contemporary rabbis seem to not want to deal with. Let's put it that way. I won't say they ignore it. They just don't want to get involved in a machlokes that is going to dig up some very, very deep-seated emotions among their membership. And unfortunately, when this happens so often, that's how breakaway shuls start, and that's how other shuls begin. So rather than get involved in machlokes, the rabbis sit back and say, whatever is. But just be aware that the differences have halachic ramifications. And that is basically, without going into the individual differences of the words and nusach, that's what I want to share with you this morning.
Wally,
Yes.
on a related topic, if an Ethiopian family moves to Philon and wants to join our shul, do they have to convert?
I wouldn't think so. No. The only issue that comes out, and Israel faced this issue, if the family is accepted as Jewish and they're counted in a minyan, The only issue would be is if an Ethiopian wanted to marry a non-Ethiopian, there might be some type of a token conversion required. Because they were separated from the normative Jewish community for so many centuries, certain questions arose. There was mixed marriages with many Christians in Ethiopia. So their bloodlines and their record keeping is not so clear. So among themselves, yes, they are accepted as Jews. If they want to marry a non-Ethiopian, then some type of a conversion, token conversion might be required.
Wally?
Yeah.
It's my understanding that the halacha is that the Torah has to be read in shul, that there's no individual requirement to hear it.
Both of those things are true. The Torah has to be read publicly, but you have an obligation to hear Kriyas Torah completely and not to miss any pesukim or letters or words. So you do have an obligation of hearing Kriyas Torah as well as having it read. There's two separate obligations. Hope that answers your question.
Wally, that's a tough minhag in a shul where only one person says Kaddish. If it's my parents or if other family members your side, you're telling me I can't say Kaddish that day. I don't think I'd.
What used to happen is they used to rotate. A different person at each minyan would say Kaddish. The whole purpose of Kaddish is to answer Yehei Shmei Rabbah, not to say Kaddish. Purpose of Kaddish is that response, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach. That's the purpose of Kaddish. So one person says Kaddish, everybody answers it. And you take turns. And if there are 20 Avelim, then you rotate it among those 20, a different person. Because people said exactly what you're saying, I shouldn't say Kaddish for my father, I have a chiyuv. But the chiyuv is not to say Kaddish. The chiyuv is to answer Yehei Shmei Rabbah. But from that one person saying it, and because to avoid machlokas, so everybody says it now. But the strict halacha is, and the briskers still follow that halacha, one person says Kaddish at a time.
How do women figure into this?
There's no reason why women cannot say Kaddish as long as a male is saying Kaddish, because Kaddish is a davar shebekdusha. It requires a minyan of men. So if there's no male saying Kaddish, and a woman is in shul to say Kaddish, one male would say Kaddish. By the way, if there is nobody saying Kaddish in a minyan, there's still an obligation to say someone should say Kaddish after Oleinu. That's a separate obligation. It's not a mourner's Kaddish. But somebody would say Kaddish after Oleinu, and you find it in many, many minyanim where there's nobody saying Kaddish for a parent. One person is designated to say Kaddish after Oleinu, both in Shacharis, Mincha, and Mariv. But if there's a woman in shul who's saying Kaddish, as long as there's a man who's saying Kaddish, because Kaddish requires a minyan of men, that hasn't changed. So as long as one man is saying Kaddish, the woman can say Kaddish along and everybody can respond.
Wally.
Yeah.
You talk about people having different minhag, and especially, I'm not going to mention anyone's name, but the 745 million, there's a gentleman who comes in that's always, every day, no matter what, says Kaddish D'Rabbanan. And that's the only Kaddish he'll say.
Yes.
Is that a Sephardi minyan? Because if it is, then it shouldn't be done in our shul.
Yeah. I know exactly who you're referring to, and that's his particular minhag. I'm not sure exactly where he comes from, but definitely Sephardic. Again, in our shul, there is no standardization for who says what or who does what. It's pretty much a free-for-all, as it is in most shuls.
Right.
There are very few shuls with standards, put it that way.
He's saying only one. He's saying only one Kaddish a morning.
That's all. Yeah, just as Kaddish D'Rabbanan.
Interesting.
Yeah. The other question that I have is, you daven nusach Sfard your whole life, right? Your father daven nusach Sfard, then you move to a community with a shul that you like, davens nusach Ashkenaz, but there are other shuls right, where they do daven nusach Sfard.
So where do you belong?
So what are you better off doing? Well, you have to make a decision where you belong, because you're coming into a new shul, a new town, and the shul that you like, davens on the Ashkenaz. But there are other shuls where you can maintain the minhag from your father and daven nusach sfar there. Do you have an obligation to go to the other shul and daven nusach sfar, or you can just change?
You
I
belong
wouldn't-
to one shul and daven in another shul.
I wouldn't call it an obligation. In your private Shemona Esrei, you can follow whichever nusach you prefer. But when you're davening in the shul, you follow the shul's minhag. So if you are davening in a Sephardic shul, you follow the nusach sfar that they use in their siddur. If you're davening in Ashkenazic shul, you follow the Ashkenaz. But in your private Shemona Esrei, you can certainly do your own Sephardic nusach if you want. There's nothing wrong with that. The difference between private tefillah and public tefillah. But as I say, there are shuls that have a handbook. In Israel, in particular, have a handbook of practices, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I made a copy once, and I gave it to some people in shul, but it didn't go anywhere. It languished. I still have a copy of it. Again, I'm a big a big advocate of standards, but standards somehow rub people the wrong way. What do you mean what I'm doing is not acceptable? And that causes machlokas. And to avoid machlokas, standards are sometimes diminished or eliminated altogether.
Minhagim are important. Minhagim are important too. My father's minhag was to put on tefillin on Chalamod. So I'm in a minor in Renat, probably a handful of people. In Israel, that was difficult. I would go in the other room. I would go into a separate place.
You have the whole issue of second day Yontif Minhagim in Israel, and the minyanim for non-Israelis in Israel on the second day of Yontif. And it's a big problem what you do in Israel if you're there from Chutz La'aretz on the second day of Yontif. Do you only keep one day? And then there's a major problem which rabbis have been addressing. There are some Americans, for example, who fly back on the last day of Yontif, which in Israel is a weekday. Halachically, very, very problematic. They are essentially mimachal Yontif. If they fly, and for those who hold that it's a weekday, because you're the minute you leave Israeli airspace, it's Yontif. Big problems, big problems.
All right.
For Israeli wannabes, big problem. So it's not easy to navigate between minhagim and halacha, and sometimes minhag becomes halacha because people forget where a certain practice began, what the implications are, and the poskim debate this even today. I mean, the Mishnah Brura, there are chuvos about it. What do you do if you're in a different shul, and with tefillin, not wearing tefillin, eating in the sukkah, not eating in the sukkah? There are a lot of different halachos, and many people mistake minhagim for halacha. I'll just conclude with one last example of this. There are many Hasidim who don't eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. And many people whose fathers or grandfathers or great-grandfathers don't eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. Okay? This is halachically indefensible. Period. Sof pasuk. The halacha is very clear. Now, there are many machloksim in the Gemara which are not resolved. The Rishonim have to pass one way or the other. When it comes to eating in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, the Gemara is very clear. The hilchasa and the halacha is you eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, you don't make a bracha leishei basukah. The whole discussion in the Gemara there. All right? Where did this minhag come from? And there are many different answers given. The one that makes the most sense, the way Rav Soloveitchik explained it, it was customary among Hasidic communities that everybody leaves home and visits the Rebbe on Shmini Atzeres. Now, leaving your wife and children home is a separate issue on Yontif, but be that as it may. So thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of Hasidim would come to the Rebbe to visit him on Shmini Atzeres. Only problem was no Rebbe had a sukkah big enough for all the Hasidim. And the halacha is The halacha is that if you are mitztayr, if you are uncomfortable, meaning if it's cold, if it's wet, you're exempt from the sukkah. So crowding all these Hasidim into a sukkah would have been impossible and very uncomfortable, to say the least. So therefore, they didn't eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres for a practical reason. In New Square, the entire roof comes off the shul and becomes a giant sukkah. That's an exception. They didn't do that in Europe. So what happened is that for those Hasidim at that time, they had a halakhic exemption. It doesn't apply today. What your great-great-great-grandfather may have done doesn't affect you today. You're not going to a Rebbe. You're not being crowded out of a sukkah. Yet, the minhag was, my grandfather didn't do it, my father didn't do it, so I'm not going to do it. And some people, well, I'll just have supper, but not lunch. It's halakhically indefensible. But it's a minhag. Gebrachs on Pesach is another minhag. May have a halachic underpinning, but basically the Vilna Gaon put knedlach in his window to show everybody there's no reason why you can't have gebrachs on Pesach. Unfortunately, most people don't know enough halacha to be able to distinguish what is halachic and what is not halachic. And that's why we have an obligation to learn more and more Torah so we can make those distinctions. Any other question? Okay. Follow your minhag. Have a wonderful Shabbos.
Have a great Shabbos.
Thank you, Wally.
Have a good Shabbos.
Shabbos on.
Yanis.
Yanis.
Good
Good
Shabbos all.
Yossi, good Shabbos, everybody. Shabbat Shalom to all.